Welcome to the party, pals. This is Die Hard on a Blank, the podcast where we explore the influence of Die Hard on action cinema, one action movie at a time. I'm Phil Gawthorne, and with me is my co-host, Liam Billingham.
Yippee-ki-yay, melon farmers. Phil, is it true that John McClane, in the edited version on TV, said melon farmers? Did he say that in the UK?
He did not say it in the UK. He said in the version in the UK, he says, Yippee-ki-yay, Kimosabi.
Oh, yippee-ki-yay, Kimosabi is not good.
Yeah, well, Melon Farmer's not great. And plus, I think that's actually apocryphal. And although there was an episode of the Goldbergs about that, but I don't think it's actually true. There's no evidence of it. But there is evidence of him saying Yippee-ki-yay, Mr. Falcon in an edited version of Die Hard 2.
Yippee-ki-yay, Mr. Falcon? Who's Mr. Falcon?
I have no idea.
That doesn't make any sense. That's bizarre. All right. Well, clearly this is a podcast about censored versions of the movie Die Hard from 1988.
Yes.
That's what we're doing here. No. This is a podcast about Die Hard. It's Christmas.
That's right.
It's Christmas time. And Phil and I decided that now was the time to launch our very own Die Hard themed podcast. Phil.
Yes.
You want to tell us about the podcast?
Yes, sir. So Die Hard on a Blank is going to explore the influence of Die Hard across action cinema. And there's a myriad of ways that Die Hard, its fingerprints made its way through the genre. Obviously, the most obvious is the various films that replicated this specific formula, which we will talk about. But it affected the genre in a number of different ways, some of which we might not be as obvious. So really, this is a film that has remained relevant and resonant over 30 years after its release, and we're gonna track movie by movie the ways in which its vibrations have reverberated throughout action cinema.
And look, we are, I think, in my humble opinion, the right guys to do this podcast. But actually, specifically, you are the right guy. Why are you the guy to do a podcast called Die Hard on a Blank?
First of all, everybody loves Die Hard, right?
Yeah.
In my opinion, the most influential action movie of the 20th century, potentially of all time. Why I can speak to that from a position of knowledge and experience is because I am a professional action movie screenwriter. I've worked for most of the major studios at this point. I used to write for the BBC and I was a playwright, but I always wanted to do commercial action cinema. So I moved out here to LA. And this is common language in the movie business. Die Hard on a Blank, it's Die Hard on a such and such, it's Die Hard in a wheelbarrow, it's Die Hard on a construction site, it's da-da-da-da-da.
Die Hard on a skyscraper, Die Hard on an Alcatraz. Yeah. Sure.
So this is, now most people kind of know that and most people understand that. But what we're going to do on the show is get into a real deep dive on why this movie works, why the films that try to follow it succeed or fail. And we're really going to quantify that through something I've put together called the anatomy of an action movie, where we're going to get really deep and discuss all of the different components and mechanisms that make an action movie work or not.
Do you remember the first time you saw Die Hard?
You know, I can't remember the exact first time because it's almost like it feels almost pre-birth. It's just always been in our life, you know. It's hard to remember it because it's just always been there. It's always been with us like a beloved family member, you know. It's just everyone has this sense of kind of a personal connection, I think, to Die Hard. It's so nostalgic and it's on every year. So it's been in our lives for a long time and I'm no exception to that. I do remember watching it many times when it was it was taped, videoed off the TV in the UK when I was a kid.
Ooh, children of the 80s and 90s, listen to you taping movies off the
TV.
Same.
Indeed. Halcyon days. And I remember watching it so often that I could remember where the commercial breaks were. And now when I watch the movie, it's kind of almost weird for me that it doesn't cut to commercial at these certain points because I watched that video so many times.
It's me in Star Wars. It's the same thing. Whenever I watch Star Wars, I'm like, why isn't there a commercial break here? That's weird.
Yeah, it's kind of just, it ingrains itself in our consciousness. And it became something that was a tradition for me. On every Christmas Eve, I would watch it. And then it became a tradition with me and my dad. And then we took it a step further and we decided to watch every single Die Hard movie on Christmas Eve over a 5-year period in chronological order. So, you know, it's certainly something that means more to me than the average bear. And you met my dad.
I met your dad. I was going to say, I think your remembering of hey, Dad, let's watch every Die Hard movie for 5 years in a row is certainly you think. Because he was like, I love Die Hard, but boy, does Phil know a lot about that movie. In his very polite British way, let me be clear.
Yes.
But he certainly thinks that you're an expert, which you are. It's true. And I think the dad thing, action movies and dads, from my point of view, is a real thing. Because when I was a kid, my dad did a couple things I think very well. One, he made me read Shakespeare at far too young an age. He told me who Jean Le Carré was at far too young of an age. And he allowed me to start watching action movies at far too young of an age. So, you know, in the way that you are to Die Hard, I am to Lethal Weapon. That was like a regular movie in the rotation at the house. Old James Bond movies. Our connection was through movies. And you know, that led me in a path to study theater, to study acting, to, you know, go to film school eventually, to kind of really go out into the far from the sort of action genre. But it always comes back to action for me. I think action movies are a sort of essential part of my diet of loving art in general. And they are art. You know, action movies are really as important as any other kind of art. They're unique to themselves. And
action movies are one of the most challenging types of movie to make. So we're coming at this whole thing from a place of love and passion and enthusiasm and genuine respect and admiration for these movies.
And we're dudes that work in Hollywood. And you mentioned the term Die Hard on a blank and described it briefly, but very quickly, for the non-Hollywood guy, what does Die Hard on a blank mean?
So the term Die Hard on a blank has become cultural shorthand for any film that utilizes this very particular storytelling paradigm. Broadly, bad guys take over a blank and it's up to one man or a woman to stop them. That is the most simple, concise version of it. But Die Hard actually influenced the action genre in a multitude of different ways. And its DNA spread throughout the genre in ways that people may not necessarily expect. And that's another aspect that we're going to explore, as well as the direct replicators.
Well, very clearly, Phil doesn't know that much about Die Hard or action movies in general. So I'll try to pick up the slack. You know, I'll try to really keep the thing moving. But what I can tell you is that today's episode, this episode, the inaugural episode of Die Hard on a Blank, will be a deep dive, minute by minute, into the original action masterpiece, Die Hard. Should we start that right now, Phil? Should we get into it?
Yes, let's do it.
Here we go.
So the movie begins with John McClane, our hero, New York City police detective, arriving in LA at the airport at LAX, and he is hoping to reconcile with his estranged wife, Holly.
And the first thing that happens is the guy in the seat next to him tells him to make fists with his toes, which I think is so amazing because him being barefoot becomes a pivotal part of the movie, and they introduce it from the first section of the movie, that it's taking his shoes off whenever he gets where he's going.
It's a great example of one of the things that this film does, where moments that seem so natural and organic and just like texture are actually part of the Swiss watch of this film's setup and payoffs that it's developing, and that one happens straight away. And there's also an interesting little moment with the flight attendant.
Yeah, they make eye contact. And it's like, it holds for a second, and you're like, it's like whether it speaks like they're attracted to each other or something, but it again adds to this, like, he's kind of unmoored in his relationship at this stage. Like, he's going to reconcile with his wife. It's not entirely clear that either one of them actually want that. And so there's just this moment where he makes eye contact with the stewardess. And in that classic Bruce Willis way, goes like, I don't know, it's great.
It's a little moment, and actually there's a story behind it, because in the book, he actually has a whole romance with the flight attendant. He comes from St. Louis. Lewis to LA, and they have a whole kind of relationship. They end up kissing at the end when they say goodbye, and he actually ends up calling her from the skyscraper as the siege is going down. So there's also a deleted scene where it's slightly, it's pretty wild. But also there's actually a slightly extended version where there's a deleted scene where she overtly comes on to him, and it was cut. I think it does speak to I think what they maybe were trying to do with that little moment was that he's a good-looking guy. He's got options, but he's got the big bear. He's focused on his daughter, his family.
Big bear, right?
So we're like, oh, we kind of like this guy, but I think the film does enough with just that subtle moment. So he arrives in LAX, and just straight away that shot of the plane and the hue of that orange sky, I just love.
Yeah. It tells you're in like a new space, you know what I mean? And like, especially because the movie's from his point of view, he's such an East Coast guy. That one thing I love about the movie is how it's kind of like, California, he just doesn't.
Straight away, it's sort of stranger in a strange land,
right.
And it's subtle, but it's there. He's also probably had to wear warm clothes because he'd be coming from the East Coast, which explains why he's wearing the white vest.
Right, and he's coming from a winter East Coast to a to the seasonal West Coast California thing. It's not cold.
Which is its own sort of surreal landscape of Christmas in Los Angeles is kind of a unique environment. It's warm, it's sunny, it's different from
and also
most places
Christmas
in the country.
Movies in LA are like a whole subgenre of action movie. I mean, every Shane Black movie takes place at Christmas, right? Lethal Weapon, Last Boy Scout, Nice Guys, which comes out a few years later, Kiss Kiss Bang Bang. They're all Christmas movies. Even his Marvel movie is a Christmas movie,
yes.
Iron Man 3.
And the reason he said that when I've heard him talk about it is because it evokes a timelessness.
Right.
And it is this strange, unusual setting, and there's a sort of familiarity
and
to
like
it.
a sad nostalgia. I think there's a little bit in all those movies. There's just something a little like, oh, it's Christmas again.
So John arrives, and then he's met at the airport by a young limo driver named Argyle, who picks him up, and he decides to ride in the front seat, which is a telling character moment.
Right.
Very skilled sort of buried exposition there through that conversation where they talk about the relationship and
just
John's
drive
kind
the
of
car,
guarded.
man. Yeah.
But it's really great. We like Argyle. He's a cool guy. He's a nice kid.
He's a real mensch.
Yeah.
Like he agrees to sit in he knows that something's up. He agrees, I'll hang out until you talk to your wife. Like, see how things are. If not, I can get you a room in a hotel. Like, he's like a real people pleaser kind of guy.
It's great. And so there's already, within a few minutes, there's like, these are two characters we like.
Right.
So they get to Nakatomi Plaza, and John is introduced into this sort of whirlwind world of corporate high executives.
Money.
The masters of the universe of their time, Japanese corporation, swashbuckling guys and women.
Coke-addled 80s executives. Yeah, exactly.
And not his crowd,
right?
Like he's kind of, he doesn't fit.
Right.
In this world.
And there's a lot of resentment, I think, that we can talk about when we're breaking down McClane's character.
Well, yeah, you were talking about the class. It was an interesting reading that you had where you were sort of saying you felt there was like a class resentment towards these like white. He's blue collar, they're kind of white collar. He doesn't like them. This is in the book, and we'll talk more about Ellis. Ellis is in the book.
Right.
It's like a rolled up dollar bill that he spots on the desk, and immediately think, okay, there's a lot of coke going on here.
Well, he says to Ellis, "You missed some."
Yeah,
which is one of my favorite kind of
Yeah.
like moments in the film. Also, the fact that Takagi says Holly's policeman,
Yeah.
I think is like very, very key. Not that like McClane has any jurisdiction in LA, but like it's not a great look that he's doing coke on her desk or whatever.
And he's
the case
clearly creeping on Holly.
Yeah.
Right.
Show him the watch.
Yeah.
Oh, the watch that then becomes like a pivotal tool at the end of the movie.
A moment that seems natural.
Right.
And is about a sort of power status play that Ellis is running on McClane kind of thing. Ends up paying off spectacularly later. So what I also think was really interesting about this scene is John and Holly, we see the pros and cons of their relationship, what brought them together and why they're having problems in a really realistic, natural way. And I was reading that apparently that scene was honed out of improvisations between Willis and Bedelia. And I think that's probably why that feels like a real fight. And they both have a kind of a case. They both kind of have a fair point of view. But it's important, and McTiernan said that the moment when they really nailed McClane's character was when he kind of bumps his head against the thing and realize, like, he's kind of berating himself for going too far. And they said he was one of their thoughts around it, and how they kind of calibrated the character was that he was a guy who didn't really like himself but was doing his best. And it also touches on some of Jeb Stuart's origins about how it was built out of an argument with his wife that he felt he should have said sorry, and then a tragedy didn't nearly happen. But we can talk about that later. But I think it's great because it's interesting that Bonnie Bedelia is such a graceful presence that she seems somehow apart from these coke-addled, nasty, the Ellises of the world.
Right.
She can work alongside them, but she seems somehow apart from them. She has a kind of elegance and she's perhaps got a bit of blue collar.
I think she's also a career aspirational woman that, like,
we don't dislike her at all.
No.
We actually think she's great.
Yeah.
You know?
And I think there's something interesting, his sort of attitude towards her choice to prioritize her career over their family, right?
It's a little bit like Caveman, isn't it?
It's like a little reactionary.
She's doing better than him.
Right. She's doing
and
much
he's
better
uncomfortable
than him. Right.
with it, and you can kind of see, like, okay, there's clearly like a deep love and attraction, but at the same time you can understand the issues that have driven them apart. And I believe I'm right in saying that they're not reconciled when the terrorists come in, right? It's actually left at a kind of a fracture.
No, she has the great
fracture.
line later in the movie that is so telling when she convinces Hans to bring a couch out and let everyone go to the bathroom, and he says like, Takagi picks his people well, Miss, and she says Gennaro, Ms. Gennaro, and like, it's a great character moment because it tells us it's like two things. It's that great screenwriting rule, right? Like, you're moving the action forward, but also it's a character moment. It tells you exactly how she feels as a character in that moment.
And
which is
but
like,
I think
I'm a single woman working
she's
in a
also
business.
protecting John, though, isn't she?
She
by
is,
doing that. So it works on a number of different
Right, that's a good point.
Contextual levels, potentially. So their relationship is fractured at the point when the terrorists, led by our suave antagonist, Hans Gruber, seize the building, but McClane slips away in the chaos. And then Gruber, and this is, again, I think it's such a genius scene, when Gruber identifies Joseph Takagi, that scene where he's reading his biographies is, again, I think a brilliant piece of writing. And I believe that McTiernan kind of came up with that because it tells Takagi's life story. It also shows how Gruber has done his research.
Right.
So we're like, well, this guy's got no holes. He has got this down to a fine art. Again, that scene, it has suspense because we're like, is he going to find Takagi?
There's a lot of menace in watching Rickman make eye contact or look at all these middle-aged Asian men. Like, it's a little tough to watch. Like, in a great way. And like, and he's sort of looking and they don't want to look at him. Very, very quick tangent. Takagi is played by an actor named James Shigeta, who's I believe a Japanese actor born in Hawaii, and he's in a movie from the 1950s called The Crimson Kimono. He plays an LA police detective who falls in love with a white woman who his partner also falls in love with. And it's shot in LA in the 1950s in Little Tokyo, and it's totally worth seeking out. I watched it during the pandemic. But there's a little bit of history in that he plays like a kind of put upon LA police detective. It's probably the movie that sort of made him famous, and like, great film noir from the 1950s. Definitely.
Wow, that's a great catch, and he is terrific. Just brings gravitas and dignity, and the way also I think it shows that he's a great leader because he's like, okay, enough. I'm stepping forward. You want me. I'm not going to hide.
Right.
Or we see all the qualities that have allowed him to ascend to this level of like a top.
He's powerful.
The top
yeah,
executive.
Sure.
He's commanding. His troops clearly love him. And we like him. So we're emotionally invested in this guy. He identifies Takagi. They take him upstairs to the boardroom because Hans is trying to extract the vault code. Another brilliant scene. I don't know if you noticed. This took. I never caught this until the last few viewings. Viewing 37. But
from viewing 37 to 39, I really noticed.
Did you notice that Theo and Carl are making a bet on whether he will?
I told you it's not over
they
yet.
exchange like a $20 bill.
And then Gruber looks at him looks at them.
Yeah.
He's like, guys, can we be
Can you
fucking
take it
professional?
serious? I'm about to commit murder.
But that stuff is what makes it so good. Like, Theo's one of my favorite characters in the movie. I spent
Theo's
20 minutes on
terrific.
that guy's Wikipedia, being like, where else can I watch this guy? And it turns out he was just in Walker, Texas Ranger for 20 years.
He was
after
also
the
in
show.
Top Gun. He played Sundown in Top Gun.
Oh my God. I
So he has
don't
one
think
really
I
great
realized
scene on the
that.
runway with Cruise where he's telling me, "Hey, we could have had him, man."
Oh, that's right.
You know,
That's
he's
right.
not got a huge part, but it is.
I did not remember that at all. Wow. That's
And Chips,
cool.
he was in Chips, the show.
Oh,
yeah.
okay. That's so
But
fun.
he's so great. So it's kind of a shocking scene, the murder of Takagi. It actually caused an issue with the ratings board. They were on the verge of an X rating. And the other thing that's interesting at this point, when the audiences were first watching the movie again, but Rickman was an unknown, so therefore, like, his unpredictability,
yeah.
you know, audiences didn't know what to make of this guy, and he's so charming and erudite, and you know. And then all of a sudden, it's just like, no, this guy's lethal and has no moral code whatsoever. So he murders Takagi. And this is, of course, witnessed by McClane, but he doesn't see Gruber's face, which was an important detail because it becomes relevant later.
That's right. He doesn't see him. He doesn't know what he looks like.
Yeah. So McClane, seeing this, tries to alert the authorities with a fire alarm. Quite a clever idea. But Hans nullifies it instantly and sends Tony after McClane. This
No one is
battle
coming
with-
to save you.
Great.
It's so good.
Very-
The casting in this movie is unbelievable. They found the most German-looking men. They probably called the German film council and were like, "Send your 5 blondest and long-haired men,
He is
please."
very German. And I say that that I have German heritage, and my grandmother was German, so
Yeah.
I'm on safe ground. But he is
He's extraordinarily German.
he's very
Like, you
German.
look German up in the dictionary, and that's what the guy looks like.
Interestingly, that the actor who hadn't done a ton was in The Living Daylights, and I believe had danced for the Berlin Ballet. So he's the second ballet dancer along with Alexander Godunov.
Right.
So you believe that they're brothers.
You know that I forget his name, but one of the henchmen later plays Vigo, the Carpathian, in
Yes.
Ghostbusters 2.
Terrified my childhood.
Joseph von
And that
Wilhelm or
painting.
something. Yeah. That painting messed me up, man.
Yeah.
I have stories. I'll save it for off mic, but that scared the crap out of me.
Haunts my nightmares.
Yeah.
And he also got a great little part in the Mouth of Madness, that guy.
Oh, right, the Carpenter
Yeah,
movie.
yeah.
Before, I think, sadly dying quite young. You know, it's like, and he was a boxer.
Great
Before,
face.
yeah.
Okay, so Tony's sent after McClane, but they duke it out. It goes badly for Tony. Breaks his neck falling down the stairs. Kills him, takes his weapon, takes his radio, and then uses the radio to contact the LAPD. But he sends him down, which is an interesting moment of kind of psychological warfare.
Yeah.
Right? It's a desecration of a corpse.
Right.
You know, and it's funny and twisted, but
He's
it's
a psycho. A little
they're
bit,
trying
yeah.
to make, and this we get into the book a little bit. McClane in the character's not called McClane in the book, but he uses intentional psychological warfare tactics to make the terrorists think that he's a fucking lunatic.
Oh, interesting.
So to destabilize them, he writes, "Now we have a machine gun."
Oh. So I feel like they replace that in the movie a little bit. I mean, I still think it's psychotic what he does, but they replace it with, and this is one of my favorite things about it, is his cunning as a detective and the fact that he's writing the information on his arm, and he looks at the cigarettes and goes like, these are expensive foreign cigarettes. Like he's a detective. And like one of the things that I'm sad about is we never got the McClane Year One prequel movie or series that they talked about for a while, because I would have loved. It's one of my favorite things about Die Hard with a Vengeance is that you actually get to watch McClane be a detective for parts of these.
It's one of the things I think that makes this movie so great is that you have a protagonist and an antagonist that are both incredibly fucking smart.
Yeah.
And seeing
And
it's a
very
chess
similar
game.
guys, which I want to talk about.
Yeah, I want to talk about that
yeah,
too.
for
And
sure.
Rickman has a great quote about that. So we're seeing this cat and mouse, two smart guys kind of figuring each other out, and the floor is clearing for these opponents to do battle. So McClane uses the radio that he's stolen to contact the LAPD, but of course they're skeptical. Although he does convince them. A classic.
No fucking shit, lady. Does it sound like I'm ordering a pizza?
I love that
It's
line.
truly, what a zinger. What a zinger.
Yes, one of my favorites.
I
It's
remember
on my
my
list
dad
of zingers.
cackling with laughter every
It's-
time we watched
it's
the movie.
wonderful.
At that part. Yeah. So good.
And the dispatcher, like, come on.
Yeah.
Like what are you doing?
I'm going to report you to the FCC.
So Sergeant Al Powell, we're then introduced to wonderful character, buying his stock of Twinkies.
Twinkies,
By the
sorry,
way,
Twinkies.
Loving the guy who's like in the 7-Eleven, like great
Well,
little...
this is like McTiernan the dramatist. Like any excuse he can have to create like little moments between people. Like he's like, they're for my wife, and he's like, sure they are, buddy.
I mean, it's just it's wonderful.
Like, of course, this cop is buying Twinkies. Or whatever. It's just such a like quintessential, and it's awkward. And Al Powell is trying to just be the nice guy the whole time.
Let's break this down. Is he buying them for his wife, or is he buying them for himself?
Well, that's a good question. I think he's buying them for his wife.
Yeah.
But I think he's going to eat one or two on the way.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's fair.
Like, he's a good guy, but he's also, like, of all of us, he's not above being, I'm going to eat this one, right?
It's an interesting moment as well, because Reginald VelJohnson has such warmth as an actor that in 2 seconds we're like, I love this guy. So Sergeant Al Powell is sent to investigate, and by this point McClane is battling more terrorists. He ends up recovering a bag of C4 and various detonators. But when he sees that Al Powell is not really picking up what he's putting down, he decides to take matters into his own hands and desecrates another corpse by throwing it out the window onto the police car.
Marco he throws out the window?
Oh, man, Marco.
Yeah,
yes.
I fucking love Marco. I just gotta, I can't
No
wait
more
to talk.
table! Where are you going,
Next time you have
pal?
a chance to kill someone, don't hesitate.
So I believe, we think of them as all being German, but I believe Marco is Italian.
Yeah.
And I think he was a soap star or became a soap star. There's also a couple of French guys.
He's so good, right?
You've got Uli as well.
Ah.
And then, of course, our Huey Lewis lookalike who is on the front desk.
Oh, he's great, that
who's
actor.
terrific.
He's so good. What's his...
I need
he on our chart
to
here?
pull that up.
We have this chart that Phil provided.
Yes, let me get it.
Not James. Eddie.
Eddie, yes.
Shot vault room, 30th floor. He's great. He's great.
He's great. So I love as well the way that he's... I'm not sure that there would be a USC Notre Dame game on Christmas Eve.
There's a lot of things that happen on Christmas Eve in this movie.
Yeah.
That, like, I would not go to a work party on Christmas Eve. I love my job.
It's pretty late at night considering we're on West Coast time as well.
It's like, I don't know, maybe Takagi is not a good boss because he's like, y'all got to come to my Christmas party on Christmas Eve. It is a little strange.
Yeah,
right?
but we'll let that go.
It's
but
a
it
great
is
movie.
like, how cool is Eddie? The way that he's like, oh yeah, sure, take a look around. Like he's playing the role of like, I'm so casual. I'm just a security guard. I don't mind even saying that I'm making bets in front of a cop.
I actually think the first few times I watched this and I thought about it last night, I was like, is this guy German and just doing one of the most amazing Midwestern accents in the world? And then you realize, no, he's just a Midwestern guy, right? But like, it actually, I like how the team is a little more international than just a bunch of Germans.
And it's also smart that they put the guy who's going to be the face of this as an American, everyman-looking guy, right? So if anyone does poke their head around the corner, it's like, business as usual.
Totally.
So, Powell does not, is like, F this. He bounces, but then McClane steps it up a notch by tossing Marco's body onto the car. And that changes the situation. And this is a key kind of turning point because then the LAPD respond in force. And we get our man, Deputy Chief Dwayne T. Robinson.
Dwayne T. Robinson.
An interesting moment about this that, I picked up probably on the viewing 32 was that Robinson is riding in the back of that car when he arrives.
Yes. I've
Right?
noticed that before. Why?
Well, it's the difference between him and McClane, right? McClane is such
Very
a good
yeah.
guy, such a blue collar guy that he's like, I don't want sort of someone, I want him to sit in the back like guilty. Let me sit up in the front with the guy.
Yeah.
Dwayne T. Robinson is like, no, I want someone to chauffeur me around.
Right. Yeah, there's a weird thing with McClane and people who are aspirational because I don't think he buys the kind of like that attitude. Like I think he sees through. There's a lot to the character, but one of the things that I love about him is he's very like, this is bullshit. Like his attitude all the time.
He has an
"This is
entrenched hatred
bullshit."
of authority,
Right?
And this is something that actually precedes in the Sinatra character and the detective that we'll talk about the key defining characteristics of that character. So Dwayne T. Robinson arrives. The SWAT team arrive. It's now a big situation.
Send in the car.
Send
in the car.
It's one of those moments, isn't it, when you're watching it again and you're like, this movie's so great, and then it just keeps upping itself.
Right.
It's upping itself. Send in the car.
Send in the car.
Send in the car. And then suddenly the movie, like just when you think this movie can't get more awesome, an armored vehicle barrels down through the streets of Century City and smashes through the railings of Nakatomi Plaza.
That moment becomes very disturbing because Hans has hit it again.
Yes.
And McClane's like
You made
you've
your
made your point, and he's like, oh, I'll take it under advisement. Hit it again, and like it's a really fucking cold-blooded moment.
Yeah.
He's a cold-blooded dude. And then the C4 moment is like it's very intense in a
Yeah.
great way. But
Yeah.
it's like, I don't know why, little nitpick, why everyone there isn't like, well, I'm now permanently deaf. Like everyone there should be rolling on the ground. Like I can't
It's interesting because
because
I'd actually thought when I used to think that moment was kind of reckless that McClane did that, but he knows that the assailants that are attacking the SWAT team are on like the
ground floor,
ground
the third
floor,
floor or whatever,
and all
right.
the hostages are on the like 30th
Yeah.
floor or 32nd floor, whatever it is. So it's actually kind of like a genius tactical
Right.
move that he does that, but it comes at a price. But he's quelling the raid. Like the raid has gone bad.
Right.
So he's like, let's reboot. I'll take over because he's on the inside track.
This is a little bit like what I think when I think of this movie as a symphony. Like it just keeps
Yes.
building upon
Yes.
itself. I think it's telling that they use Beethoven in this movie because I think McTiernan is like a very orchestral kind of director. And I think sequences like this show his ability to like play the orchestra of the movie that he's made.
I mean, again, I've got some great quotes about this later, but that you're 1,000% right on that from the research that I've done about him. He overtly says he thinks in musical terms and he thinks in sort of symphonic
Right.
terms, movie making as
Yeah, you can
symphonic.
totally feel it. I may have read this somewhere and I'm just forgetting that I read it somewhere, but there's something about his ability that makes me feel like he's a conductor.
So then we get to another classic scene where Ellis takes it upon himself to try and intervene.
Hans, Bubby.
I'm your white knight.
What am I, a method actor? Hans, put the gun away.
So a great scene of coke-fueled hubris.
Right.
Right? Like he's like, look, I'm a negotiator, right? This is what I do. I negotiate complex international deals. So from his point of view, he's like, okay, well, look, let me try and like find some common ground here. We can kind of sort this out. One of the things that I think is brilliant about this scene, again, I probably picked up on viewing 38, is the line.
I think it was 34.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah,
Thank
I
you.
have my list of your viewings here, and
thank
it says 34, Ellis note.
Appreciate that.
Yeah.
He says, if you think about the absurdity of this line, look, just tell them where the detonators are so no one else gets hurt.
I love, this is what I think is great about this movie is there's humor around the edges.
Yes.
But like that moment is deadly serious for McClane. And I love how there's a line after where Powell says like he did everything he could for that guy. But at a certain point, it's like John McClane doesn't have that much power, right? He's in like such an impossible situation. And all he can do is be like, this guy's going to hurt you. Like these guys are not joking around. And we know because Hans does not blink when it comes to shooting Takagi, which is such a powerful part of the movie that like he's dead. They're going to kill him, you know? And it's satisfying because Ellis sucks, but it's also sad and a pitiful moment. And like you feel bad for this guy because he's like way in over his head.
yeah,
As
he
you
just
said,
doesn't.
it's like a
well,
coke-fueled
and McClane
hubris.
literally says, Hans, this guy does not know what kind of man you are, but
Right.
this is
But
not
I do.
Ellis's world.
Right.
Ellis, just because Hans Gruber is in a suit
Right.
and seems to be acting in a gentlemanly fashion when he's not murdering people, doesn't mean that him and Ellis are like simpatico.
All right. I can't wait to talk about Gruber more. 'cause,
Yeah, we're gonna get deep
Yeah.
on
He's
Hans.
the best.
Wonderful scene of tension, but yeah, it's like, what can McClane do? He's basically saying, so you want me to return the detonators to this guy so that what's he going to do with them? You
Right.
think he's just going to like blow up some fireworks? This is what Ellis is not understanding.
Right.
He's just thinking, he wants this, let me get it, but he's not thinking, why does he want the detonators? I've taken away something that can weaken. This is all guerrilla tactics.
Right.
You're taking away your enemy's weapons to weaken them and confuse them and create more problems for them and disrupt their plan. This is all what McClane is
And all
doing.
McClane really can do is buy time.
Yes.
Like that's the thing that's sort of existentially complicated. He's like
Yes.
he can't defeat the terrorists really. Really, he's like thinking on his feet, improvising that, and that's one of the best things about this movie is that like McClane is really like DIY the whole time, which I think is what makes him partially sympathetic. Is like it's a lone man in an impossible situation.
But I think as well with like guerrilla warfare, which he's sort of doing an extension of the mentality behind it from the research I've done around it, is that you don't sort of take on the enemy head on, especially if you're
Right.
outnumbered. You have short skirmishes that weaken them one by one and wear them down.
Right.
So I think
It's like the Revolutionary War, which might be a controversial topic for an Englishman and an American to toast it, thank God. But no, it's that same thing that you learn about, right? Like,
well, how do you defeat
small
yeah.
contingent, you know.
How do you defeat superior enemy?
Right.
You have to use kind of a different sort of style
A
of
superior
tactics.
enemy that also follows traditional tactics, which is interesting because Gruber does not. He's a much more complicated, like, sort of commander than he's smart, but he's got everything figured out.
But he's also willing to sacrifice his own men, as we
Right.
find out later. But I don't want to get ahead of ourselves.
Yeah,
so,
you're right.
So Ellis has tried to intervene, but ends up being killed by Hans. It ends up going badly. Then we get to another classic scene. Again, the movie continues to top itself, because while checking the explosives on the roof and looking around, and Hans is trying to find the detonators, Hans encounters McClane, one of the all-time classic scenes. So let's break this one down.
So here's my question to you. Okay, so real quick, Hans knows it's McClane, or he assumes, he figures it out.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
The implication the first time I watched this movie is that McClane has no idea that it's Hans. But I think he knows that this guy is not Bill Clay from, Room 32 or whatever it happens to be. I think it's like in rewatch, and maybe I'm wrong about this, that's why he gives him the gun with no bullets in it. The gun is a test. He hands him the gun.
I agree. And the first time I watched, again, going through my viewings, the first time you watch it, you think you might assume that, he does. McClane has been successfully tricked. But I think it's like he suspects he could be a terrorist, but he's not sure. So it's like, I better not kill him. So he needs to run a test on him. And there's a bunch. It's kind of like, it reminded me of the scene, I just watched The Princess Bride, and the Battle of Wits scene.
It's been a long time, but yeah, of course.
It is a battle of wits.
Right.
Obviously in Princess Bride it's done for more, it's a more comedic, playful scene, but in this it's two smart guys figuring each other out and who is going to kind of break first. And I think he does. There is a possibility from McClane's point of view. He's wearing a suit.
Right.
He's speaking with an American accent. There's a very possibility that it could be an escaped hostage, but so he has to sort of suss him out. There's also a very interesting couple of moments. Don't necessarily read on screen now, but for various reasons they were cut out. There's two things that in addition to the gun that McClane does. One, he gives him German cigarettes, which are apparently incredibly strong. And if the guy smoked them and coughed and was like, "Holy shit, these are a little bit tasty,"
Right.
he would have been like, "Okay, you're American." Gruber smokes them without a second thought.
It's a little bit
that's
the
first.
Three Glasses in Inglourious Bastards. That's how they
Yes.
know that Fassbinder is not German, but is in fact English.
It's a classic scene, but it's
scene in a
exactly
classic
the same principle in a
Right.
weirdly similar way because of the German element and the deception element. But if you think about, why would he offer him a cigarette? Like, they're not just chilling out.
Right.
Like, okay,
It's
sure,
a little bit of a test.
it's a test. And the other thing,
German cigarette.
this was cut out. When the guys arrive, right, just going back a second, when the terrorists arrive, apparently there was a scene that was cut. They all synchronized their watches, and they're not, at that time, not a common watch for Americans
Right.
to have. So there's actually a moment that this was cut because it was hot, because of the ambulance thing. You know how when they arrive in the truck, there was not an ambulance in there. It's
Right.
probably the only flaw in the entire movie. But they get away with it because they cut it quickly so that you don't really see what's in the truck, and the human mind
Oh.
doesn't go.
I've never been like, well, that ambulance is out of
You don't
place.
think about
Yeah.
it because it was skillfully edited in a way where I guess you could say that maybe there was an ambulance in
Right.
there. But when that was a late edition because they were shooting this on the fly and things were being changed on the fly. But apparently you do see that he checks out Gruber's watch still. At the
That
moment,
makes sense. Again, McClane, the detective.
The detective.
Right, is very good at like reading people and understanding them and knowing.
And
they
what was
are.
the movie
Yeah.
that this was preceded was called The Detective, and
Which
it was
I've never
exclusive,
seen.
which we'll get into, but it's exclusively about the nuances and the minutiae of detective work. And it's a great point that you made that this is not only is he sort of kind of combatant, but he's also a detective, and that's what makes him a formidable foe.
It gets glossed over that McClane is not just a superhero. In fact, one of the things I think is really interesting about this movie is that and this sounds a little heady, but like there's a little bit of a meta quality to this movie in the sense that they reference Rambo. he says at one point they have enough explosives to orbit Arnold Schwarzenegger.
yes,
and I
yeah.
think it's a very wise choice by the screenwriters to be like, McClane is a guy that watches Arnold Schwarzenegger movies, not Arnold Schwarzenegger himself. One of the screenwriters, Steven D'Souza, wrote Commando.
Correct.
Right prior to this. And like, there's a huge difference between Schwarzenegger and Commando and McClane in Die Hard. And I think that one of the things that's really great, it's a little cliche to say he's an everyman, but they do a very good job of being like, yeah, this is just a guy that you'd sit next to on a plane and have a weird conversation with about making fists with your toes. He feels like an everyman. I think also the shoe thing, the feet, the fact that he's making fists with his toes is what later coming on after this, when he sort of gets surprised by Carl, and I forget who the other German assassin or terrorist is, they shoot the great moment in the movie.
Can I do this?
Please, I'm a little jealous, but I'd like it. It's your podcast, so I think you should do it.
Shoot the glass.
Yes! Oh! I love that moment. I love one of my favorite moment besides shoot the glass is when McClane is in the corner huddled over and he just goes, Jesus Christ. Because they're just laying this glass out.
It's very real. It's visceral, and it's like, holy
And the
shit.
movie does an amazing job of constantly reminding you he's barefoot. One of the great lines in the movie is 7 million terrorists in the world and I got to kill the one with feet smaller than my sister.
So, and this moment that follows the battle of wits, and then Carl and the other terrorists arrive before McClane can deal with Gruber effectively and take him out, leads to really, what we call in, kind of screenwriting structure, your lowest point, right? For McClane, where his feet have been destroyed. He's been kind of really debilitated now in terms of his ability to be an effective combatant.
Right.
And this scene where he calls Powell on the radio and he talks about his wife, and they both talk about their vulnerabilities, it feels like, first of all, it's an incredible piece of acting from Bruce Willis, which I don't think he sometimes gets enough respect.
Yeah, he's on the verge of tears.
An actor, in general. I think people forget because he became such an iconic movie star. You also you don't get to become an iconic movie star unless you have some acting prowess. And Bruce Willis in that scene, he thinks he's going to die.
Right.
In my opinion, that's how he's playing the scene.
Right.
He's like, I'm
never
probably
going to
die.
Wife again.
And the last thing I did was fuck up with my wife. And it's really moving.
Yeah, it is. Well, not to discuss, to get too tangential here, one of the things I think is really interesting about action movies from the 80s is after playing Martin Riggs in Lethal Weapon, Franco Zeffirelli cast Mel Gibson to play Hamlet. And he cast him to play Hamlet based on the scene in Lethal Weapon when Mel Gibson almost blows his own brains out in the first 10 minutes.
And that scene is so raw.
It is so raw and it's so amazing. And apparently Franco Zeffirelli saw it and was like, that guy is Hamlet.
Well, that's Hamlet's dilemma,
yeah,
right?
Exactly. And I just think it's so interesting that, there was this moment in the 80s where it's like, maybe action heroes can do Shakespeare and vice versa. And then, of course, McTiernan spoofs that in Last Action Hero, like in a really funny way. But the point is, like, one of the things that's great about these movies is that great actors played these parts. We talk a lot about how Marvel movies have great actors, and they do, but like great actors did really good action movies in the 80s, that have so much pathos because they're such good actors.
And in the 90s, I think a lot of actors became great actors that wouldn't ordinarily have done action became attracted to it, which is something that we're going to explore as the podcast goes on. But certainly this is a terrific scene, very, very moving and emotional. And then I believe it's also where Al Powell kind of talks about his tragedy, which is a difficult scene. And then our boys, Agents Johnson and Johnson.
No relation.
No relation. Robert Davi and Grant L. Bush.
Yes, that's right. He's one of the cops in Lethal Weapon 1 and 2.
Correct. But weirdly, from my research, he plays two different characters in Lethal Weapon and Lethal Weapon 2. And they're both cops, but they have different names. So
that's
just
really
a bit
interesting.
Just a weird bit of trivia.
Is he in the scene where Griggs gets out of the vest?
I think he's one of the cops in the police station.
Right.
And
but he has a quick scene in the first one with Danny Glover. Anyway, this isn't about Lethal Weapon.
Right.
But yes,
that's a separate. That's
Robert
a separate
Davi,
episode.
though, great late 80s. We'll probably talk about him a couple more times. Well, I know we're going to talk about him. We're going to talk about
him. I want to particularly talk about him in License to Kill, which is a movie I want to cover, which I think Die Hard did have an influence on.
That's for sure.
But So these guys turn up and they, in their mind, take control of the situation. I love how he says to Dwayne Robinson, like, "Oh yeah, when we commandeer your men, we'll try to let you know."
Right.
Try.
I actually noticed that for the first time
Try.
last night, and I was like, what a dick. Because it's interesting how,
He
like...
outdicks Dwayne Robinson.
Right. Well, and the fact that Dwayne Robinson becomes almost immediately just like... What's the word?
He's
the
emasculated.
shittiest guy, but then when the FBI shows up, and this really factors into what I think is really interesting about this movie. When he shows up, he kind of becomes benign, right? Like,
you actually kind of sympathize with
yeah,
him.
he's a little. I think we're gonna have to get some new FBI guys.
Yeah.
It's one of the great movies in this.
Yeah.
But like, he kind of like loses any power. And early on, you hate him.
They
and
cut
by
his
this point
legs
in the
off
movie, you're
straight
like,
away, you know. But also, he's been inept,
right?
And
He's
these
very
guys are
inept.
kind of turning up. You know, it's federal level now, and it's like, okay, like, you know, it's big boys' time. So they turn up, and they also, you know, have the same kind of hubris, albeit in a slightly different way. They're very arrogant, and they're moving the anti-terrorism playbook is to shut off the power. But
which
of course,
opens up the vault.
Which plays into Hans' plan.
And this has been his plan the whole
What
time.
a wonderful moment.
Yeah.
And again, this is the moment that we'll talk about when we talk about Martina's approach, but the joy of that moment. And because they're thieves and not just terrorists, there's kind of a moment where you're like, well done, guys.
Did you see that
To
quote
Gruber.
from Stephen E. D'Souza where he said that he almost wrote the movie from Hans's POV?
Yes,
because
yes.
he's the character who sort of drives the story forward. And I think what's really interesting about this movie is it's certainly not the first, but it's definitely one of those movies where you're like, man, the villains are as cool as the hero. And that tension like the fact that you're kind of like, it's pretty awesome when they get the vault open and you're kind of into it, even though you're ultimately like, these guys are going to get their comeuppance.
Okay, so the FBI guys' tactics end up opening the vault, which is this great, wonderful, joyous moment with the Beethoven. And they agree to Hans' demands for helicopters, which is all part of his ruse, but their intention is to send these gunships instead. McClane then realizes that Hans plans to blow up
Wait,
the
sorry,
roof.
you just blew past something I think is very
please.
important, which is we have to do the line, which is just like fucking Saigon,
yeah.
slick. And he says,
I was in junior high, dickhead. Interesting. Their relationship, like, are they bros or no?
no, I think
Doesn't
Special
seem
Agent
like it.
Johnson, Robert Davi is Special Agent Johnson, right? Or it doesn't
It
matter.
doesn't matter. That moment never made
I
sense because
think-
every FBI agent is a special agent.
This movie
So-
is really good about like power dynamics, obviously, and like it's interesting how like Dwayne T. Robinson is Powell's boss, sort of, or like a higher up, and like he's a dickhead, and Davi is a dickhead, and I think I'm sorry, who's the actor who?
Grandel Bush.
Grandel Bush
Yeah.
is like this fucking guy too. Like I don't think anyone likes their boss in this movie except Holly and Takagi.
It's interesting, yeah, because there are a lot of like hierarchical things going on about bosses, about your superiors.
And the only person without a boss in this movie is John McClane.
Right. Yeah. And therefore he's free, and unencumbered with those
Right.
restrictions
Right.
to act outside the parameters of bureaucracy to function effectively, and
Right.
that even if it's like considered unconventional or inappropriate. So McClane realizes as the gunships are inbound that Hans now plans to blow up the roof and kill the hostages, but the vengeful henchman Carl intercepts him before he can warn the LAPD of this imminent danger. What a fight that is.
So good. I have a
I want
whole
to cook
theory.
you. I want to fucking eat you.
I have a
It's
whole
great.
theory about that relationship in the movie that I'll spin at you later.
Yeah,
but
yeah,
like,
yeah.
man, the
Spin it now if you
casting of
want.
Alexander Goodenough. Well, one of my favorite shots in the movie comes a little bit earlier when he's having the firefight on the roof, right before Al shows off, and it cuts to this shot of Carl walking across the
Stalking
helicopter pad,
silently.
stalking,
Yeah, yeah.
and you have this moment. And then the next thing, he gets the gun and he shoots, and McClane like spirals out of control and falls over. And it's a really great moment to establish that like Carl is a slow, meticulous, revenge is best served cold kind of guy, played by a ballet dancer. And so he's graceful and elegant, and like he's still. And he has a stillness, and McClane is all freneticism, all movement, all can't stop, won't stop moving. And it establishes again this like the idea of the movie, which is like McClane just has to move to survive, and Carl has this ability to just kind of like I can do whatever I want. And it's this sort of, let me put it a different way. He has this kind of ability to stalk people and move slowly, and he has all the power. And I think it's mirrored in a lot of movies, action movies in the 80s, where the second in command is almost as important to the tension as the main. I'm thinking of Lethal Weapon 2.
Well, Shane Black does this almost every time.
Yeah.
The henchman, the number 2 guy in the criminal hierarchy, or the antagonist, is actually the main adversary.
Right.
Gary Busey,
Long
Kiss Goodnight, Craig Bierko,
Right.
and Milo in Last Boy Scout. It's something he goes back to the well on, and he's amazing at it.
And it's just so great how you feel this gap between them physically that sort of reinforces how different they are as people. Like, Carl is a stone cold psycho, but McClane is just trying to survive. And, like, it does a good job of setting them up in opposition
It's
to
such
one
a great
another.
point. I'd never really thought about that. That probably would have come on viewing 47.
Yeah, you were going to get there next
I'll get there
time.
eventually, but I needed a little bit of help from you. And no, you're right, because they have these totally different physical styles and energies and approaches. And that's almost, Carl takes quite a lot of punishment before he responds in
Right.
that fight. You know,
God, and when he finally chokes him with that chain and sends him flying, it's like, oh, this is brutal. It's so brutal.
yeah,
but
and
it's
that's
great.
it. It's right, like, because Carl is more methodical,
Right.
as you say, is more patient, and McClane, it's just a desperation. There's a desperation.
He can't stop moving.
It's pure survival
And
mode.
he can sort of think on the fly. And again, you cast someone who can move elegantly like Alexander Goodenough. Like, even when he flails and hits the table when he's frustrated that he hasn't got him yet, he like stops, he pauses, he looks over, and then he loses his mind. Like, it's all very like McTiernan being like, you're a ballerina. Be one, like really just move like a panther or like a cat.
Yes,
Like, there's something really interesting about that side of it. I just think it's like very, very fascinating to watch. And they don't have the like deep interpersonal kind of relationship. There isn't this like long established history, but the movie just goes to great lengths in a great way to be like, these are very different figures. The long swath of Goodenoug's blonde hair versus McClane's kind of like crop cut style. Carl's dressed in all black. Like, it's just very smart. It's very thoughtful in setting up. And again, as a writer or as a director, it's like, these are the kind of choices that really make this movie stand apart. Like, we know who these guys are and we cast the right actors to do it.
The motivations are slightly different as well in the fight, aren't they? Because for Carl, it's revenge, and for McClane, it's survival.
Right.
It's like, it's not.
It's
I don't
always
really know.
survival.
It's just survive the next moment and keep moving, like, as you said.
And also, how does Carl die? He dies flailing. He dies moving in a way he never moves in the entire movie. He can't control
He's
his own
robbed
body.
of his
he's robbed of his grace and agency and ability to move the way that he knows how to move.
Or is he dead?
Oh, that's right. How did I forget?
Interesting.
Right.
When they would always, when on British television, which had some minor cuts for the more extreme, some of the violence that was cut for British television. So in my first 20 viewings, I wouldn't see these moments. But the shooting of the legs in that shoot
It's
the
really
glass
gross.
is really, that bit was always cut because that's pretty horrific.
Yeah, and it's slow. It takes its time.
Graphic, slow motion, and blood splattering through the legs. And they would always cut the bit where the close up of Carl struggling in the chains.
Right.
So it was weird. It actually affected your viewing of the movie because it was kind of like his death was almost an afterthought. And by having that shot, you were like, oh, he is definitely dead.
How does he get down?
We do know he has incredible physical strength.
Right.
So I don't know that it's beyond the realm of possibility that he could figure it out. But,
I like that they borrow this trope from horror movies. That the villain has one last sort of one last hurrah. And of course, then it completes.
It completes Al's
journey.
But before we get to that, we also have Dick Thornburg's news report that makes, because he's been, to quote McClane, a fly in the ointment throughout this whole time, buzzing
a
around,
pain in the
causing
ass.
monkey in the wrench. And, he's causing mayhem with his hubris and opportunism. And his really horrible news report where he goes to the McClane household makes Hans realize that Holly and John are married, and that prompts Hans to take her as a personal hostage while the others are sent to the roof. So So after McClane has managed to take Carl out and he drives the hostages from the roof, we then get to possibly the greatest moment of this symphony. As all of these elements are converging, the FBI gunships they think McClane is a terrorist. McClane is trying to get the hostages off the roof. He knows it's loaded with a massive amount of explosives. He's now trapped in this impossible situation. And because he's such an ingenious and inventive character, he quickly finds a solution to what seems like he's been backed into an impossible corner, and takes the fire hose and wraps it around his waist. And he's talking to himself as he's doing this, which he has to do a lot.
Please don't let me die.
And you're just like, how the fuck do you get into this shit?
So good. Come out to the coast. We'll have a few laughs.
And what a moment of just sort of like, that it makes complete sense. It's totally practical. It's totally logical, albeit in this extreme scenario. And we were just talking about how the symphony reaches this point of crescendo, then the music is pulled. McClane jumps with the fire hose attached to his waist. The roof explodes, and he is able to survive, whereas the FBI gunships do not. And then, of course, they had this one of the most iconic shots of him shooting the glass.
Shooting the glass with the blood from his feet,
the blood from his feet, which was very intentional. He goes from bad to. But it goes from like good. It's like, I think there's a technique for this, or there's a term for it, where it's like good news, bad news. The good news is he's managed to survive, but the bad news is the fire hose is now going to pull him to his death.
So I've seen this movie 20 times, 30 times, and I mostly can sit through it sort of watching it.
You gotta watch
I know. I gotta catch up with you. I'll start tonight. But every time I watch it, I have a physical reaction to him moving towards I start to move my body in a way where I'm like, oh, get the thing off.
So stressful.
You really feel it. Yeah. You really feel it, and like that doesn't happen in a movie that you've seen 20, 30 times. But still, every time I'm like,
the suspense,
because that's really scary.
Palpable,
Falling to your death. It's really scary.
It's more scary than being shot or all of these other things.
Right.
There's something more frightening about that. Meanwhile, Theo is retrieving a hidden ambulance that was the intended to be the bad guy's escape vehicle, but Argyle gets his hero moment and sparks him out. And then now we have our final showdown where McClane finds Hans and Holly and appears to surrender, but because he's got two bullets left. There's three guys to take out. So we've got Eddie is still alive.
Let me just check our chart that I have.
We'll just check our terrorist chart.
Eddie, yes, Eddie is alive. Hans, Alexander's dead. Yeah.
I believe it's a French guy, because I always thought that, when Hans is throwing the money around, the bearer bonds around.
Christophe. It's Christophe.
I thought he was saying Holly, but when I had the subtitles on, he's actually saying Allez.
I've never caught that before.
I never caught it either.
An American that speaks no other languages.
Yeah.
Right. Yes.
Well, I'm not exactly multilingual myself, but we now have our high noon moment, right?
Yes.
And McTiernan was talking about how this is he was like, oh, this is such a tired trope. He felt embarrassed to do it. The bad guy puts the gun on to be crude about the love interest character. Obviously, Holly Gennaro is much more than that, but just in his terms,
it's the iconic structural image.
We're now in that showdown. Hans has a gun to Holly's head, but there's two terrorists to take out, and John only has 2 bullets. So how is he gonna, solve it? But he actually obviously pistol whips Christophe first, I think, to sort of clear the table, and then we get into his fine rhapsody of violent genius, which is the gun taped to his back.
Right.
And he seems to surrender, and he tricks them into thinking he's surrendered.
Well, it's that great laugh moment where they're all laughing together, and it distracts them.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy.
McClane looks fucking insane in that moment.
Talk about
he's
horror,
all teeth, he's covered in blood.
Yeah.
Like he doesn't even have a tank top on anymore, and he's just laughing. You're like, this guy, he's making them think he snapped. Yeah, exactly. Hans, and he limps to the finish line.
I suppose it also speaks that he's trying to make them think that he's not like compos mentis to the level that he actually is. Still. I want them to think that I'm more weak than I actually am, to trick them into what I'm going to do to them.
Right.
So it makes sense. He's like selling the hobble and the really messed up. But actually, when he blows them away, because of course what happens is he tricks them by pulling a hidden gun. Holly, knowing McClane the way she does, senses like he's not going to surrender.
Yeah, no, there's a great shot of her face.
She clocks like something's going down, and I need to be ready when it does. Because she knows her husband, and she knows this is not a man that's going to walk into this situation and hand over a gun. He's got some move up his sleeve, and I need to be ready when it goes down. Right. And sure enough, she is. So when he pulls the gun off his back and shoots them both away, suddenly McClane's demeanor is completely different, right? He's no longer like, Hans. He's like, got you.
Right.
Happy trails, Hans. Bang, bang.
And then maybe the great screenplay. They fall out the window. Hans holds onto her wrist, and you realize he's holding on by the gold watch that Ellis has given her in the movie.
What a touch.
What a touch. And McClane manages to get the watch off. And he falls to his death. But also, like, from a screenwriting perspective, it sort of symbolizes, like, any conflicts between them, like any other person that kind of comes between them is now out the picture, and they're sort of reunited. And the movie does a great job.
Piece of symbolism, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because it's like the last connection to the Ellises of this. Because Ellis seems to take, it's like materialism, isn't it?
Right.
It's like flex the watch, flex the Rolex. Like, this is not the woman I married that's like obsessed with material
and that
values.
80s Wall Street greed thing that this movie has an interesting relationship to. I also think...
And those shackles are shed in that moment. Yeah.
I think that's why it's such a good symbol, because it can be interpreted as like, oh, it's the excess of that, or you could view it as like the sort of thing in their relationship that needs to be severed so that they can connect again. I think another thing that's interesting is that the movie ends with them leaving the building. And the building like represents her job. It's the first place he goes in LA. He doesn't go see his kids first. The first thing she says is like, come to my work party. And you got to think in his head, he's like, I just want to see my kids. You know what I mean? Like, and so the fact that they leave the building as a reunited couple, as we're led to believe, feels like it's a little bit of an escape from the problems. Or not an escape, but they're going to patch up the problems.
Or a reprioritization, perhaps.
That's a great way to think about it. It's not like she's quitting her job, right?
No, and nor should she.
Also, is there a job anymore? Does the company still exist? Yeah.
New podcast, What Happens to Nakatomi?
Right.
The Nakatomi Corporation the next day.
Takagi's sort of like
where did they go?
I mean, yeah, exactly. What happened to all those bear bonds?
What about the project in Indonesia? Like, what's going on with that? Like, I need answers.
A 12-part investigative series to the aftermath of
we're going to talk about the building of the bridge, engineering, like...
There's something here!
Yeah. So, but then we think that's the ending, but there is one final...
Fly in the ointment. A pain in the ass.
Which is our friend Carl returns, resurrected, half dead, tries to kill them, but it's
Al Powell pulls his gun and
saves the day.
Yeah, saves the day.
We do have another little moment of violence. Thankfully, the violence
Thank
continues.
goodness the violence doesn't end.
Because Holly punches Dick Thornburg as Argyle arrives in the limo to whisk them away, and they still have the bear in the back as well. So
the bear's in the back.
The nuclear
so
family is going to be reunited, and paper falls from the sky like Christmas snow.
Harmony is achieved.
I mean,
that's a pretty good movie. I guess
okay. It's all right. And the song "Let It Snow" plays.
That's right. That's right. Oh, I forgot it was Let It Snow.
Yeah. So
that's Die Hard.
So that's the movie.
It took us as long to get through it as the movie runs. So congratulations on your free feature-length commentary.
But it's that good that it requires that level.
I agree. So Phil, we've talked our way through the movie. What's next? What next time on Die Hard on a Blank?
Next time in our next episode, we're going to talk about what makes a good action movie. We're going to talk about the anatomy of an action movie, and we're going to talk about Die Hard's DNA, the origins of Die Hard and the influences upon it.
I can't wait. That you've done a ton of research on this. There's a lot we're going to learn about. It's going to be very exciting. So I want everyone to show up next time with your education hats on. It's going to be time to learn.
But I'm a fun teacher. I like to think I'm a fun teacher.
You're fun. You're
I
like
roll up the sleeves of my
throwing the
corduroy jacket.
baseball in the air, pacing around the room, being like,
I'm like
so
the
Cara,
teacher that's like, call me Phil,
Yeah, exactly.
Don't call me Mr. Gothel.
You don't have to call me Mr. Gothel. Call me Phil. We'll be back next time. Thanks, everybody. Die Hard on a Blank is a podcast hosted and written by Philip Gawthorne. Liam Billingham co-hosts and produces the show. Mike Mayer and Michael Sugar are the executive producers. Special thanks to Suki Chu and the whole team at Sugar 23. We'll be back next time.
Ah, Finally, it's my time. My time to escape the everyday at Slots.lv. With my choice of hundreds of thrilling casino games, when I joined, Slots.lv tripled my first deposit. And if you sign up now, you get a bonus of up to $3,000 and 30 free spins. I really love my time on Slots.lv when I hit one of their hourly jackpots. And you will too. Slots.lv. Your time to play.